All right. Well, I guess I'll share my screen here for the slides, so I can figure this out here. Here we go. Is that showing up okay?
Yes.
All right. Okay. Get this situated. All right. So this is a follow up to the first presentation we did last week regarding life, death, and the soul, and it presented, I assume, a lot of questions. It usually does. What about this? What about that? So that's where this presentation came from. So when we discussed last week the nature of the soul, and that it is comprised of two ingredients: the dust of the earth and the breath of life that comes from Yahweh Himself. Without one of those two ingredients, the living soul or the living being is not. It isn't being anymore. So if again, to use the analogy we used last week, if you are if you take the soul and you compare it to like a light bulb with electricity coming from the electric company, and that's the spirit from Yahweh, your soul, the thoughts and emotions and the choices and actions, and your character is the light from that light bulb. And when the electricity goes back to the electric company, excuse me, or the bulb breaks, the big question is, where does the light go? And we showed a number of verses last week that just says, right, the light goes poof, vanishes away, perishes until the resurrection. So this then goes into hopefully enough of the questions, the big questions that come up regarding verses regarding hell or heaven. And I hope to address all of them. If you have more questions, maybe we have time to dive into those too. I'd love to discuss them. So the big question: do we go to heaven? And I like to just start off with John 3:13, which we talked about last week too, I believe. And it says, "And no man has ascended up to heaven, but he that came down from heaven, even the Son of Man which is in heaven." So when we're talking about, for instance, like the saints of David or Abraham or whoever, are they in heaven? Here's words from the Messiah himself: no man has ascended up to heaven. The only one that has is the one that came down from heaven, the Son of Man, who is now in heaven. One big question that came up when I first started presenting this was, well, what about that boy? Because this was really popular a few years back. What about that boy who came back in that book that he and his dad put out? His name was Alex Malarkey. The boy who came back from heaven. What about him and his fantastic story and all the other stories that are like that? Well, as it turns out, Alex Malarkey later became a real believer. He grew up and he became a believer. And he says, "I did not die." This is his own confession. "I did not die. I did not go to heaven. When I made the claims that I did, I had never read the Bible. People have profited from lies." He's speaking about his father, actually, who continued to push this book and this idea. He says, "People have profited from lies and continue to. They should read the Bible, which is enough."
It's all malarkey.
It's all malarkey. I would agree. So, from the mouth of the boy who said he went to heaven himself. And I think we would probably find similar backstories for other books or whatnot. And if not, there's other explanations as well. What about near-death experiences? That might kind of even dovetail into the boy who went to heaven story. Are they all lies? I don't think so. I think a lot of honest people see real things. Are they really dead? That's a good question. What is dead? I think our medical industry doesn't really have a clear grasp on what that is. We have different definitions, like clinically dead or brain dead or terminally dead. And, based on whether or not they get an electric signal from the brain, or whether they have a pulse, or, so, I don't know how we're going to define death. for these people, but they, according to modern medicine, they are one of those. So how do we explain some of their experiences? Well, excuse me, one interesting thing that came up in my research was the topic of DMT, or dimethyltryptamine. And it's been talked about, as a drug that opens the third eye. People who have traveled to the Amazon rainforest have partaken in ayahuasca, which is they're guided through an 8-hour deal with a shaman who, gives them this tea to drink, and they drink that, and they end up having an 8-hour trip where they're blasted off into space. They see God, they meet God, they figure out all their problems, their addictions go away. Amazing. And it's always the same. It's always the same story. It's pretty interesting. If you get a chance to watch DMT, the spirit molecule, it's a documentary on Netflix that's really, really interesting. It dives into some of the research that has been surrounding DMT. And researchers are attempting to discover whether DMT can allow the brain to survive longer without oxygen. And what's interesting about DMT is that when you have a traumatic injury, your body produces and dumps into your system a ton of DMT. And so when people are having these near-death experiences, they're tripping. This is way more powerful than acid and all these other psychedelic drugs. This is something that living animals and plants produce, including human beings. This is the same chemical that is operating in your brain to make you dream. So the reason why your dreams are kind of trippy are a result of DMT. So yeah, here in my slide, I've got, in a response to a life-threatening situation, the lungs can synthesize large amounts of DMT and release it into the arterial blood within seconds. DMT is involved in the healing and regeneration of cells. Again, this is part of a lot of mammals and also plants, which is where ayahuasca comes from. It comes from the root of a plant in the Amazon. So that might explain near-death experiences. They always seem to be very similar. People, go through this light and they blast off into space to meet what they all consider God, or some sort of, all-loving entity, and have conversations and learn about the secrets of the universe, and they come back and kind of forget it all. Anyway, it's a Schedule I drug, so I don't recommend trying to find any. But that might explain near-death experiences for those that aren't just lying through their teeth. So what about that verse in 1 Corinthians 5:3, absent from the body, present with the Lord? I think that's the one I hear most often in an objection to the idea that the soul just perishes and doesn't go to heaven. And I think if you look at the context, it's, he's really saying, he's not saying that he does go to heaven when you die, or you do go to heaven when you die. He's just kind of positing in 1 Corinthians 3 that he wishes that he was physically there with the folks that are having some trouble with a troublemaker in the congregation, and that he is present in spirit, he says, which is really just saying, I'm thinking about you, you're on my mind. But in 2 Corinthians 5, that's where we find that that idea that there's more to this existence. Maybe we're a spirit that floats off into heaven. But really, you look at the context. So he's using some euphemisms for death, for this corruptible body versus the resurrected body that we get. And when you see the whole thing, he is talking about the context of the resurrection. In 2 Corinthians 5:10, he says, "For we must all appear before the judgment seat." And that happens at the end of time. That doesn't happen on an individual basis at the point of your death. Philip also in 1:23 says, "For I am in a strait betwixt two, having a desire to depart and to be with the Messiah, which is far better." And the reality is when you depart, you don't go right to the Messiah, but you can desire to have that experience firsthand, as if we were talking last week about the idea that as far as your consciousness is concerned, it expires upon death, and then the next moment that you're conscious is with the Messiah. It is at the resurrection, maybe 1,000 or 2,000 years later for these guys. So again, who is in heaven? Is Enoch in heaven? Is Moses in heaven? What about Elijah? These people seem to have some different experience where they were either caught up by a whirlwind or column of fire, whatever you want to call it. But Hebrews 11:3-9 says, "And these all," speaking of a long list, including Enoch, Moses, and Elisha, "obtained a good report through faith, but they received not the promise." What's the promise? It's the resurrection. It's that new resurrected body. So it says, again, "received not the promise, Yahweh having provided some better thing for us, that they, without us, should not be made perfect." Perfect, again, being a reference to the resurrected body. So they received not the promise, and they're not going to without us. It all happens at the same time. Just to kind of bring up Enoch in Genesis 5:23, it says, "And all the days of Enoch were 365 years, and Enoch walked with Elohim, and he was not, for Elohim took him." And Hebrews 11:5 says, "By faith Enoch was translated, that he should not see death." Well, there you go. You got me. That he should not see death, and was not found, because Yahweh had translated him. For before his translation, he had this testimony that he pleased Yahweh. That's a great thing to be said about Enoch. But what do these words mean? I mean, translated. What is that? Translation.
I don't know how to raise my hand.
Oh,
but I just wanted to interject. It says,
yes.
It says they're Elohim, and it's translated as God, which Elohim has a variety of meanings. And we know from the book of Enoch that he was with the lesser Elohim, the angels.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay, I've got a challenge for you in a little bit.
Excellent.
Okay.
I hope I can meet it. So moving through to what is this word translation, and that he should not see death. John Gill, the famous Baptist theologian from 1600, says, all men, in his commentary, says, all men wicked and righteous, and though there have been some exceptions, as Enoch and Elijah, and all will not sleep or die, some will be found alive at Christ's appearing, yet such will undergo a change which is equivalent to death. I think that's what that translation is, and that's what he says here is, as Enoch and Elijah have done, they experienced a change that is equivalent to death. And generally speaking, men die but once. So what he's saying here, which is interesting that this is John Gill, Baptist theologian, probably is saying he disagrees with a lot of modern people on the state of Enoch and Elijah. And he's saying that this translation, I think it's this thing that Paul's talking about as well, this twinkling of an eye. If you're alive at Christ's coming, you experience this body has to experience some sort of death. And you may just be resurrected in your new body immediately, which is going to be in the twinkling of an eye. But here John Gill says Enoch and Elijah experienced a change equivalent to death. Here's 1 Corinthians 15:52 through 53. In a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trump, for the trump shall sound, and the dead shall be raised incorruptible, and we shall be changed. For this corruptible must put on incorruption, and this mortal must put on immortality. So again, I would say, when are the dead raised? They're raised at the last trumpet. It all happens at one time. It doesn't happen upon your death and then that guy's death and some other time. 1,000 years ago, some guy died and he's already there. We all do this together. We all see the resurrection together. In 1 Thessalonians 4:15, it says, for this we say unto you by the word of Yahweh, that we that which are alive and remain unto the coming of the Master shall not prevent them which are asleep. For Yeshua himself shall descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of the archangel, and with the trump of Yahweh, and the dead in the Messiah shall rise in the air first. Then we which are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Master in the air, and so we shall be ever with the Master. Again, we're at the last trump when this happens, when everybody is resurrected. Proverbs 34 speaks to this question of who is in heaven. Who has ascended up to heaven or descended? Who has gathered the wind in the fist? Who has bound the waters in a garment? Who has established all the ends of the earth? What is his name? And what is his son's name, if you can tell? And these are all like rhetorical questions here. Who has ascended and descended? Who has ascended up into heaven or descended? It's attached to this. What is his son's name? And we read about that in John 3:13 earlier. And no man has ascended up to heaven, but he that came down from heaven, even the Son of Man, which is in heaven. What about David and those saints that supposedly were resurrected upon the crucifixion of the Messiah when he raised, and all those dead were walking around the streets? I've heard from others that those were the saints, Abraham, David, Jacob, all the old fellows that were there. They were the ones that were walking around. Well, Acts 2:34 through 35 says, for David is not ascended into the heavens. This is in Acts 2. This is after the ascent of the Messiah. He's already up in heaven. And here we're reading that David is not there. So it wasn't he didn't go, we didn't see like Christ go down to hell or Sheol or Abraham's bosom and gather up the saints like David and such and take them to heaven with him. That didn't happen. It says David is not ascended into the heavens. I find that fascinating. Does David go to his son? In 2 Samuel 12:23, we have the situation where David is lamenting. He says, but now he is dead. He's talking about his son. Now he is dead. Wherefore should I fast? Can I bring him back again? I shall go to him, but he shall not return to me. David didn't go to heaven, as we just read. David went to the grave where his son is and where everybody else is dead, until the resurrection when we all are raised together. Ephesians 4:9 through 10 says, now that he ascended, talking about Christ, what is it but that he also descended first into the lower parts of the earth? He that descended is the same also that ascended up far above all heavens, that he might fulfill all things. And this is where people get into this idea that Christ went to hell, or he went to Sheol, or he went to Abraham's bosom, or whatever, and preached the gospel and saved a bunch of people down there. Or there's various different stories about this and interpretations of this. But I want to point out that this word of is not in the text. It's the lower parts, semicolon, the earth, if you will. The lower parts, the earth. And on this next slide here, I'm showing how the earth is the lowest realm. It's not Sheol. It's not some underworld. That's all Hellenistic stuff that's been added in through hundreds of years. The first heaven is the sky. The second heaven is the space where the planets and the stars live, and the third heaven is Yahweh's abode. But he who came down from heaven, Hashamayim, from the heavens, went to the lowest realm, the lowest part, the earth, and he ascended up through all the heavens back to Yahweh's abode. So that kind of wraps up whether or not people are in heaven besides Messiah himself. Hopefully it wraps up, Enoch and Elijah and Moses and whatnot. What about hell? Sheol is used 31 times as the grave in the scriptures. Gehenna is used 12 times as a place of burning. Hades is used 10 times as the grave. And Tartarus is used 1 time in the scriptures as a place of darkness. Our English word hell, it comes from Norse mythology. Hell is a being who presides over a realm of the same name, where she receives a portion of the dead. It derives from Proto-Germanic halo, which means one who covers up or hides something, which is actually very appropriate, which itself derives from the Proto-Indian European kel, meaning to conceal. Sheol itself is an interesting word. The righteous and the wicked both go to Sheol. They both go to hell, if that were the right word to use. It's more, I think, more appropriately the grave, and no one praises Yahweh from Sheol. It's a place or state of no return. So when you go there, that's it. That's the end. You're dead, you're dead, you're dead. Except for the hope of the resurrection. That's the whole point. That's the whole point of the resurrection, and the hope of it is that it's something miraculous. And the other definition here is the unseen state, which if you go back to this word hell from Norse mythology, to conceal or to hide something or cover up, that's the same thing. It's this unseen state, like the light when it goes out. Where does it go? When the bulb has its electricity returned back to the electric company, where does the light go? It's unseen. It's no longer. That's Sheol. That's the state, this unseen state of you're not being anymore. Gehenna is originally the valley of Hinnom, south of Jerusalem, where filth and dead animals of the city were cast out and burned. It actually is a very fit symbol of the wicked and their future destruction. I think, as we kind of discussed before, in the judgment, maybe your tabernacle is, really wood, hay, and stubble, and you're just going to burn a little longer than the others if you're Hitler or whoever. But eventually they do burn out. There's no more fuel for the fire, and they just are ashes under the feet. Hades comes to us from Greek. It's the name of the god of the underworld. It's interesting that in Latin, it's also known as, he's also known in Roman culture as Pluto, which is, the outermost non-planet, I guess now. It's the realm of the dead in Greek mythology. In our scriptures, it's the grave, it's death, it's translated hell. It comes from these 2 parts in Greek, the letter alpha and the word Edo, meaning unseen, again, not seen, goes back to hell from Norse, and Sheol having the same idea of unseen, the unseen state. And I found this pretty interesting that, before we discovered some of these other extra planets out there, Pluto was the outer one, the one that's darkest away from farthest away from the sun. I don't think that's any coincidence, actually. I think that there's a reason why Pluto is, the outer one. They called it Pluto for a reason, probably. Tartarus in 2 Peter 2:4 is where it's used, and it's in one particular context. For if Yahweh spared not the angels that sinned, but cast them down to hell, that's Tartarus, and delivered them into chains of darkness to be reserved unto judgment. So this is that scenario in Genesis 6:2 and Jude 1 where the watchers came down, and we read about it in Enoch. The watchers came down, they cohabitated with women, and their punishment was to be cast down to, here it says Tartarus, the outer darkness. I find that really interesting. I've read a couple different, I'd be curious to hear, what you have to say about this, Jackson, in terms of where they are today. I've heard that they are buried underneath the earth, and that there are still cracks in the rocks near this mountain where they're buried, and that some of the ancient text that I wrote, or that I read, excuse me, said that said one of those phrases like, to this day we still know where this is, and that people were going there to learn magical arts from the whispers that came from the rocks.
I'll tell you, around Jerusalem on the south side, there's the Valley of Hinnom, Gehenna, and this comes from ancient literature too. I got it all written down someplace, but I'll just explain it. There is a passageway that goes down from Gehenna, and it is a fiery passageway because it leads down to the lake of fire. But on one side of the lake of fire is what's called the second heaven, and on the other side of the lake of fire is the fifth heaven. Now, I might get this mixed up, but the fifth heaven holds fallen angels. The second, what did I say, second heaven?
Fifth?
There's a fifth and the second, I think. The second heaven on the other side holds the offspring of fallen angels called the Gibborim, the mighty men of renown.
Mm-hmm.
So they're separated, and they can't see each other because they're on two different sides of the lake of fire. But the parents, the Nephilim, have feelings, and they're desperately missing their children. Desperately. They even cry over their children, and here they're stuck in a hole where they can't get out, they can't see them. So they're forever mourning for them. But their children, on the other hand, are psychopathic. Now, after Gibbor comes in the flesh, you kill his body, maybe in the flood, but what's released then is an eternal angel. So Gibborim have flesh and an angelic spirit. They are sociopaths. They don't care a whit for their parents, but they play on that in an ESP kind of situation. They play on that, and they can contact their parents in the other heaven and tell them how much we need you and get us out of here. And when you're released, make sure to release us so we can get back together again. Just like sociopathic children do to their parents. But in Enoch, it says they'll never see each other again. And this is why they had the idea that Gehenna was a place of hell. And in the New Testament, Gehenna is always translated hell in some of these versions, because that's the entranceway, because the fire always burned there. They threw dead corpses on there. They threw all kinds of trash and dead animals, so forth, on that heap of fire. And it just burned and burned and burned. Today, it's a beautiful place. But then the passageway going down was to be blocked in by a gate. And the other two down there with the Gibborim and the Nephilim are blocked by a gate. So what is supposed to happen is that in the end, and for the sake of the just in all creation, those two pits are going to be opened up into the lake of fire. They're not coming back out, with the exception of in Revelation, it talks about Apollyon or Abaddon being let out, and a bunch of demons fly out of that pit. Probably the same thing. They end up eventually in the lake of fire, and they're tormented there forever. So if there's any truth to those legends, then the lake of fire is not for people. That's for eternal ones. This is why you hit the nail right on the head when you talked about the soul, the soul being a separate part, and an immortal soul especially. That comes from paganism entirely. Hebraic teaching never says anything like that, but rather, like you said, body and soul or mind are the same thing as nephesh. Thank you. Enjoyed that.
Excellent. I hadn't heard that about a place underneath Gehenna. That's interesting. I had read something else that had placed them buried in large stones somewhere at the foot of some mountain.
Yes.
And
at the foot of Mount Zion.
Interesting.
But let me say that I'll send you over a diagram here. It'll explain it more.
Oh, that'd be great.
When we're done.
Yeah.
And it's got references on it too.
So I was going to continue to just talk about Tartarus a little bit, that in Greek mythology, it was a place of punishment under the earth to which, for example, the Titans were sent. This is from ancient Greek sources. And I find that interesting that, this place, they have a very similar story to our Watchers story, where the Titans are sent there. The primordial deities in Greek mythology are Uranus, the father sky, Gaia, the mother earth, Kronos, time, which is interesting because it's described as serpentine man, lion, and bull heads. It's kind of interesting that it parallels a little bit of our description of the cherubim. And Tartarus is one of the primordial deities, or the abyss. And that's, again, where our Watchers were cast, Tartarus. The Titans were giants. So this is kind of where it departs just a little bit from our story. But the Titans were giants. They're the offspring of the heavenly and the earthly. And when overthrown by the new gods, they're cast into Tartarus. And Jude talks about this Watcher's predicament when he in 1:6, where he says, "And the angels which kept not their first estate, but left their own habitation, he has reserved in everlasting chains under darkness unto the judgment of the great day." Again, we're talking about, just to throw that in there, judgment happens at the end here. Hades equals Pluto equals the underworld equals Tartarus equals outer darkness, right? Pluto is in the outer darkness of our solar system. I don't know if any of the listeners have heard of Gil Boussard and his Planet X or Planet 7X stuff. He's got this incredible presentation that he can do that just talks about this planet, this brown dwarf star or something that's got this orbit. And if you've heard of the stories of the Anukim and how they're on this Planet X or Nibiru, and it's got a ton of different names in different cultures, but he says he's tracked it to even these biblical stories of hellfire and brimstone raining down upon Sodom and Gomorrah, and all these other times where it's come and it's affected us, and it's in all these cultures. It shows up as that sun disk, that Egyptian sun disk or that Babylonian sun disk with the wings. And he says that that's actually this brown dwarf star that has this electric universe interaction with the other bodies in the solar system, and that makes this and forgive me, Gil, if I'm getting all this wrong, but it makes this aura that looks like wings on the side of this sun-like disk, or this brown dwarf star, a very cold star, failed star, if you will. And he says it's got a 350-year orbit that comes in through the solar system. It's around our sun. And it goes out and then it comes back. And when it comes back, it always wreaks havoc on the earth in some way. And he says every 350 years-ish, or 325 years, somewhere in there, it's not precise, but somewhere in there, he's gone all over the world and he's found historical records where something significant has happened every 355 years or 350 years, somewhere in there. Especially in the biblical accounts, it lines up with Sodom and Gomorrah. Anytime there was hellfire coming down from heaven with sulfur or whatever, he attaches that to this planet coming into range, and its debris field being something that Earth passes through. Anyway, it's fascinating, and I kind of thought that because the Babylonian and Akkadian and their stories surrounding these beings from heaven that came in, cohabitated with women, that they, go to this planet X and are jettisoned outside of our solar system, could be, again, a reference to this outer darkness that they're cast into, and that they're not under the earth per se as much as they are in this under the pressures, the extreme pressures of the gravitational forces and matter that's crushing them in this brown dwarf star, and that's their punishment as they cycle around our sun every 350 years. Anyway, it's kind of a side note, but if you get a chance to go and look at his material, I think it's a fascinating interpretation of a lot of biblical texts, including Revelation, and how he sees that playing out in the end here soon. Unquenchable fire with regard to hell. In Jeremiah 17:27, Jerusalem was under unquenchable fire. But we can see that today, unquenchable fire doesn't mean that the fire never goes out, because Jerusalem isn't on fire today. 2 Chronicles 36:19 through 21 is the fulfillment of the entire issue there. Everlasting fire. In Matthew 25:41, it describes Sodom and Gomorrah under everlasting fire. But Sodom and Gomorrah aren't even smoldering anymore, right? We don't see anything burning in that area. The worm dieth not. These are all things that are euphemisms, right? Unquenchable fire means that the fire isn't going to be put out until the fuel is gone, right? I mean, if you have an unquenchable fire and your house is on fire, and then the fireman comes and he says, "Oh, this is unquenchable," it means that they're not going to be able to put any amount of water on to put this thing out. It's just going to have to burn until the house is gone, till all the fuel is burnt up, and then it goes out on its own. And that is also, a good picture of, I think, again, the destruction of the wicked, where they burn until they can't burn anymore. There's no more fuel left. Here, with the worm dieth not, and they shall go forth and look upon the carcasses of the men that have transgressed against me. For the worm shall not die, neither shall their fire be quenched, and they shall be an abhorring unto all flesh. Isaiah 66:24. The worm, or the maggots, they die not the man. The worms, they die not because they're feasting. It's a metaphor for there being plenty of dead corpses to feed on, or many are going to die. right? That's what it's referring to. And this idea of eternal punishment, again, is like more of a Hellenistic thing. It's Greek corruptions entered into Judaism and then passed on to Christianity and so on. Prometheus is an eternal punishment. He's chained to a rock where his liver's eaten daily by an eagle, only for it to be regenerated at night due to his immortality, the immortality of his soul. Sisyphus has to push a rock up a hill and then it rolls back down and he's got to do it again. The judgment is a fire, yes, and it's a fire with everlasting results, not everlasting in duration. Again, what we talked about last week was that you don't get eternal, the choice isn't between eternal life in the good place or the bad place. It's eternal life and death. And we really need to redefine or understand the real definition of death. And if you haven't taken a look at last week's presentation, I recommend that. What about the rich man and Lazarus? Is it literal or is it a parable? If it's literal, then people in hell can see and talk to people in heaven. That sounds kind of crazy. If you interpret Abraham's bosom to be heaven, some people call it paradise, and that's different than heaven. Okay. Whatever the case is, these folks can talk to one another if this is to be taken literal. They have a body before the resurrection, if it's literal. I mean, he's got a tongue that he wants to be quenched with water. Abraham can resurrect Lazarus in verse 27 is implied there. If this is to be taken literally, there's all sorts of other problems with this. If we really break it down, is this literal? And it's probably a parable. Martin Luther taught that this story was a parable about the rich and the poor in this life, and the details of the afterlife are to not be taken literally. That's what Martin Luther said. E.W. Bullinger, he said, it is not called a parable because it cites a notable example of the Pharisees' tradition, which had been brought from Babylon. Well, that's interesting. This is an old Babylonian story that the Pharisees picked up when they were in exile. And some scholars suggested the basic storyline of the rich man and Lazarus was derived from Jewish stories they had developed from an Egyptian folk tale about the journey of Osiris. So there's all sorts of places where they pick this up. This is a cultural reference that's being used to make a point about something. But is that point that Yeshua is trying to address, is it about heaven and hell? Or is it or the afterlife? Or is it something else? Is it like Martin Luther said about the rich and the poor? Alexandrian Jews brought this story to Palestine, is what one other commentator said, where it became popular as a story of the poor scholar and the rich publican, and he even had a name, Bar Majan. There's a lot more to be read about the Egyptian folktale stuff, and I have links that I can publish for those that want to read more about it. But the moral of the story, though, isn't about heaven and hell or the afterlife. It's actually teaching us that the prosperity gospel is false, or what we would call the prosperity gospel today. But they had a very similar thing back then, where Yeshua was teaching, contrary to the prevailing view, that wealth was not an indicator of divine favor, just as poverty was not a sign of Yahweh's judgment upon a person. So we get that a lot in Word of Faith movement and things like that, where they flat out say wealth is an indicator of divine favor. And if you're not, getting rich, it's because you're not giving enough to the televangelist. Yeshua also says in this parable that Moses and the prophets is sufficient in communicating the good news of the kingdom. That's another moral of the story, is that having some guy raised from the dead and go tell him about this afterlife or whatever, that's not going to do it. Moses is enough. Moses and the prophets are enough to communicate the good news of the kingdom. And I think there's a secondary prophetic message. I think there's a reason why Lazarus' name is used. In Luke 16, where he's going over this, he says, if they hear not Moses and the prophets, neither will they be persuaded, though one rose from the dead. That's what Abraham said. And I believe that's what Abraham said, if I can remember that parable correctly. But I think he's saying here that when he says, though one rose from the dead, and the reason he uses Lazarus in here is because he is kind of, in a sly way, maybe prophesying that Lazarus will be raised from the dead, and that won't persuade anybody. That's also not going to work. Somebody actually raising from the dead won't be able to persuade anybody. Moses and the prophets should be enough, but because their hearts are hard and they're just not going to receive it. And I think it also is true of Yeshua himself. Though he raises from the dead, it doesn't change their hearts. I have this note here that this is a relevant text. This passage is referring to the intermediary state before final judgment, and therefore has nothing to do with the state after judgment. What about the thief on the cross? This is a famous one I get a lot. When Yeshua said unto him, verily I say unto you, today shall you be with me in paradise. So obviously, the thief on the cross is going to be with him as soon as he dies in heaven. It says it right there in Luke 23:43. Undeniable. Except for those tricky commas in our English translations, they aren't in the Greek text. And so it's really the translator's prerogative, or maybe it's really his bias and what his theology has already been set to be, that interprets this text and putting the comma where he does. If you just move that comma, or maybe we'll change the pause for those that are just listening, verily I say unto you today, you shall be with me in paradise. That's a little bit different. It's a little bit different. He's saying, truly I say unto you today. Today I'm telling you, you're going to be with me in paradise. Versus, truly I say unto you, today you will be with me in paradise. There's a difference there, right? It's like the difference between let's eat grandma or let's eat grandma. That comma can save lives.
That's funny.
And what's interesting is that if he did go to heaven that day, remember Yeshua dies and he's in the grave for 3 days. Yeshua 3 days later, when he's found, having been risen from the dead, he says in John 20:17, Yeshua says unto her, touch me not, for I am not yet ascended to my Father. He hasn't gone to heaven yet. Did he just lie to that thief on the cross, saying, today you're going to be with me in heaven, in paradise? He says, for I have not yet ascended to my Father, but go to my brethren and say unto them, I ascend unto my Father and your Father, and to my Elohim and your Elohim. He hasn't done it yet. It's 3 days later. Something to think about. Going back to this idea that during those 3 days, Yeshua went to hell and he spoke to the spirits in prison, 1 Peter 3:18-20. I'll read that part. It says, for Messiah also has once suffered for sins, the just for the unjust, that he might bring us to Yahweh, being put to death in the flesh, but quickened by the Spirit, by which also he went and preached unto the spirits in prison. A lot of people interpret that as being he went down to Hades or Sheol or Tartarus or whatever, and went and he gathered up all of the righteous ones, or there's a bunch of different stories surrounding this, but goes through and says maybe he grabbed David. We already discussed that David is not in heaven, right? So some say that Christ, upon his death, went in his human soul to hell or purgatory or limbo or Abraham's bosom or paradise, etc., either as some to preach to devils and damned spirits that they might be saved. Maybe it was dead humans, pre-Christian or pre-Christ believers. Some say demons or fallen angels that he was preaching to. Some say the cohabiting fallen angels. Some just angels and messengers. There's a lot of different views. But the answer is in the context, because in 1 Peter 3:20, right, we were in 18 and 19. You just go to the next verse. It says, which were formerly disobedient in the days of Noah, when the long suffering of God commanded an ark to be made in hope of their repentance, and 8 souls only entered into it and were kept alive in the waters. So the context of the spirits that are in prison, which is just a euphemism for folks that were imprisoned by their own lusts or what have you, lives that were in need of repentance. This was happening in the days of Noah, where Noah was preaching the gospel with the same spirit that the Messiah was quickened with. That's what it's talking about. It says, for the Messiah also has once suffered for sins, the just for the unjust, that he might bring us to Yahweh, being put to death in the flesh, but quickened by the Spirit. And then here in, I think this is the King James, quickened by the Spirit, by which he also went and preached, by which, the Spirit by which he went and preached unto the spirits in prison, which were formerly disobedient in the days of Noah. So that's the context. It's not hell, it's not Hades, it's not any of those things. It's that Spirit that quickened the Messiah to life is the same Spirit in the days of Noah that was preaching repentance by way of Noah. When Noah was building the ark, this is one of the many views there are here regarding this, but I'll give you, I think, 4 or so. When Noah was building the ark, Christ in spirit was in Noah, preaching repentance and righteousness through him to unbelievers who were on the earth then, but are now spirits in prison or people in the grave. That's what I would say. View number 2 is after Christ died, he went and preached to the people in hell, offering them a second chance of salvation. That doesn't sound like equal weights and measures to me. I'll get a second chance. Is that justice? I mean, what about those of us that don't get that second chance that are born after Christ? It doesn't make any sense that there's a second chance for those before Christ, but not after. There's too many unanswered questions with that one. View number 3, after Christ died, he went and preached to people in hell, proclaiming to them that he had triumphed over them and their condemnation was final. Wow. I thought the judgment wasn't until the resurrection, but here, these people are condemned right here and in the time where Christ is dead, waiting to be resurrected himself. View number 4 is after Christ died, he proclaimed release to people who had repented just before they died in the flood and led them out of their imprisonment in purgatory into heaven. That's one of the Catholic views. View number 5, after Christ died, or after he rose, but before he ascended into heaven, he traveled to hell and proclaimed triumph over the fallen angels who had sinned by marrying human women before the flood. Again, that doesn't make any sense to me. The Apostles' Creed actually has this in there. Suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, dead, and buried. He descended into hell, if you read the English translation. And the third day he rose again from the dead. That's in the Apostles' Creed. But again, if we're looking at hell in terms of it just meaning the grave, or this unseen state, or Sheol, or whatever, that's okay. We can agree with that creed. We can say that he descended into hell. He descended into the grave. He became poof. He didn't exist anymore in the sense of the soul that we call Yeshua. John Gill's view, that famous Baptist theologian from the 1600s. He's one of my favorite commentators, by the way. He's not always right, but I sure like him. He says, to all the instructions and warnings which God gave them, to all the strivings of his spirit, and to the ministry of Christ by Noah, which seems most likely, that being the term of time in which God's long-suffering waited on them, during which time Noah was preaching to them and building the ark. So he's saying, long and short of it here, is that this spirits in prison time period is during that time which Noah was preaching to them by that same spirit that quickened our Messiah while he was building the ark, saying, hey, there's a flood coming, guys. It's judgment on you guys. Augustine's view is, according to Augustine, the spirits are the unbelieving contemporaries of Noah, to whom the spirit of Christ in Noah preached, or to whom pre-existent Christ himself preached. Again, these aren't my crazy ideas. Augustine is in here, although sometimes Augustine has some crazy views, but John Gill, is there with me. Interestingly enough, the Aramaic says souls in Sheol. It doesn't say spirits in prison. I find that interesting, just to give it a twist that maybe that soul and spirit thing got mixed up again, as it does in Greek oftentimes.
That's prevalent, and it messes things up bad.
Yeah, and it happens all the time. They just switch back and forth like it's no big deal. And I think I sort of explained it in last week's presentation, that I thought that it probably has to do with the sense that the soul is incorporeal like the spirit. It's not something tangible because it's your character. Your character isn't tangible. You can't, without the body at least, there's nothing else to grab onto. This is it. The body is the only way I can interact with the world. So I think that's where it comes into play, is that they just say, well, it's intangible, so they're the same thing, I guess. Anyway, I belabored that one long enough, but that one was a difficult one just because of the word spirits in prison, and people get really hung up on it because, if I just gloss over it, it doesn't seem to sink in. And I didn't want to make it seem like it was just, my crazy view. I wanted to show that there's a lot of views, and there's some, big wigs that have come to the same conclusion. Anyway, moving on to Saul and Samuel, there's that situation where there's the witch of Endor, and, Saul is inquiring about stuff, and he lists a necromancer. So in 1 Samuel 28:6, it says, and when Saul inquired of Yahweh, Yahweh answered him not, neither by dreams, nor by Urim, nor by prophets. Which is a good context to start with, because Yahweh's not talking to Saul. For some reason, we think that if he goes and gets a necromancer and goes against the law of Yahweh, that's when Yahweh's going to speak to him through a dead prophet, even though it says here that Yahweh is not answering him by prophets. But we continue. In 1 Samuel 28:12, it says, and when the woman saw Samuel, she cried with a loud voice, and the woman spake to Saul, saying, why have you deceived me? For you are Saul. Who saw Samuel in this situation? It wasn't Saul who saw Samuel. It was the woman. Did the entity know things? We know that the dead know nothing. So that we learned that in the last presentation. The dead know not anything. They have no part in anything under the sun. So I'm not sure, again, how we would consider Samuel to be alive or disembodied and communicating here. In the next verse here, 13 and 14, it says, and the king said unto her, Saul, be not afraid, for what sawest you? What did you see? Because he didn't see it, right? There isn't some apparition that he's looking at. She sees it because she's the one talking with familiar spirits. And the woman said unto Saul, I saw Elohim ascending out of the earth. And he said unto her, what form is he of? And again, he doesn't see anything. Only she sees this thing. And she said, an old man comes up, and he's covered with a mantle. And Saul perceived it. He regarded that it was Samuel. He just assumes, because I guess an old man with a mantle is only something that Samuel could be. I don't know. And he stooped, and with his face to the ground, he bowed himself. Did King Saul see Samuel again here? No. He asked what she saw. She saw an old man with the prophet's mantle. In 28:8, if we go back a little bit, rewind, Saul disguises himself, and he put on other raiment, and he went, and 2 men with him, and they came to the woman by night. And he said, I pray you, divine unto me by a familiar spirit, and bring me up him who I shall name unto you. Again, I just want to belabor this. Divine unto me by a familiar spirit, a practice which is forbidden, and he had cast out all these folks in the land. And again, this is forbidden by Yahweh, and he has decided not to talk to Saul by any of the legitimate methods, and yet we're supposed to believe that a necromancer can come and divine by a familiar spirit anything, right? Even just, even if we ignore all the other verses about the dead being dead and they know nothing. In Deuteronomy 18:10, 12 is where we find those commandments. It says, there shall not be found among you that use divination, or an observer of times, or an enchanter, or a witch. This is the witch of Endor here. Or a charmer, or a consulter with familiar spirits, or a wizard, or a necromancer. For all who do these things are an abomination to Yahweh, and because of these abominations, Yahweh, your Elohim, does drive them out from before you. I'm pretty sure Yahweh's not going to release the consciousness of Samuel and let him go and let Saul circumvent all of the law here with regard to familiar spirits and necromancy and divination and get access to the future. Again, the dead know nothing, but apparently this one knows the future. I don't know. It's somebody, maybe somebody else has got an explanation. The transfiguration is probably the last one I'll address here, because it brings up Elijah and Moses being seen by others, multiple others. Mount Hermon was suggested by R.H. Fuller and John Lightfoot as the location of the transfiguration for 2 reasons. It's the highest place in the area, and the transfiguration took place, quote, on a high mountain, it says in Matthew 17:1, and it's located near Caesarea Philippi, where the previous events reportedly took place. So Mount Hermon, it's an interesting location. Elijah is dead. We learned that before. The situation in 2 Kings describes it and says, "And it came to pass as they still went on and talked that, behold, there appeared a chariot of fire and horses of fire, and parted them both asunder, and Eliah went up in a whirlwind into heaven. And Elisha saw it, and he cried, my father, the chariot of Israel and the horsemen thereof. And he saw him no more, and he took hold of his own clothes, and he rent them in two pieces," like you do when you're mourning. Right? So Elijah's dead. We know that. Moses is dead. So Moses, the servant of Yahweh, died, and it says this in Deuteronomy 34:5. Moses, the servant of Yahweh, died there in the land of Moab according to the word of Yahweh, and he, Yahweh, buried him in a valley in the land of Moab over against Beth Peor, but no man knows of his sepulcher to this day. So Moses and Elijah are dead. So what did these guys see when they woke up on the Mount of Transfiguration? Well, in Matthew 17:9, it gives us the answer. This is the simple answer. "And they came down from the mountain. Yeshua charged them, saying, Tell the vision to no man until the Son of Man be risen again from the dead." So again, this is a vision. This isn't something. It's a shared vision. It's something that was given to them for some reason. This is the most simplest way to explain it. Is it just says it's a vision. That's the simple way. But I have a better explanation, I think. And I find this, fascinating. I think that you've got these two guys, Elijah and Moses, in their own times, and Yeshua in his own time. And they're on mountains. And they're experiencing maybe Yeshua has unzipped the space-time continuum here. And he's actually delivering the law to Moses at that very moment on the Mount of Transfiguration. And he's actually speaking to Elijah on the mountain with Elijah as well. And that they're actually seeing not a pre-incarnate Christ, but actually Christ himself on Mount Hermon. What do you think about that, Jackson?
Well, you know me. I like speculation, especially when it's speculation that comes into a more modern type of idea than some of the older ideas. Yes. That's why I can say the millennium is here.
Yeah.
And speaking of ascending, was there a time when he wasn't here?
Good question.
Really? They say that, he's on his knees in the sanctuary begging pardon for your sins. Give me a break. He's working, and we're working.
Yeah. So I figured I'd just read these couple passages from the three different accounts, the one of the Transfiguration, the one of Elijah, and the one of Moses, and just kind of compare some of the similarities. And it is speculation, but I think it's fascinating to think that they didn't see a vision, that they actually saw Moses and Elijah alive in their own times, and saw Yeshua giving Moses the law right there. So anyway, and Mark 9:2 is where we find one of the accounts, and it says here, after 6 days, Yeshua takes with him Kepha, Peter, and James and John, and leads them up to a high mountain apart by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his raiment became shining, exceeding white as snow, so as no fuller on earth can white them. And there appeared unto them Eliah, or Elijah, and Moses, and they were talking with Yeshua. In Exodus 34:6, we read, and Yahweh passed by before Moses, him, and proclaimed, Yahweh, Yahweh, El, merciful and gracious, long-suffering and abundant in goodness and truth. So Yahweh passed by before Moses. And then 1 Kings, with regard to Elijah, in chapter 19, verse 11, it says, and he said, go forth and stand upon the mount before Yahweh. And behold, Yahweh passed by, and a great and strong wind rent the mountains and brake in pieces the rocks before Yahweh. But Yahweh was not in the wind, and after the wind an earthquake, but Yahweh was not in the earthquake. Find that fascinating. Those are it, just that they both say that Yahweh passed by both Elijah and Moses, and they were all up on a mountain, different mountains, by the way, but all on a mountain. And anyway, that's the last thing I have for that, just to end on a wild note in reference to the Transfiguration. But I'd love to hear anybody else's views on some of these things.
I wanted to challenge one thing.
Yeah.
And that's, again, in John 5. It looks to me like there's 3 classes here. One class are the regenerated, people of spirit, and Yahshua says they don't die. And then the second class are people who did good, and they seem to have a chance to live. They're resurrected. And then the third are the people who have done evil, and it says they'll be damned, but the word there is krisis, which means, it's a legal term, they'll go to trial. And so my belief is that those people that are regenerated of spirit, born again of spirit, this is not the Holy Spirit. This is the human spirit that Adam lost, that's restored to us, that are born again. And that part of us just cannot die. So I think that we go directly into the resurrection. Like you said, there's no time is folded upon itself. We go directly into the resurrection to work in the millennium or wherever, somewhere on earth, because there's so much work to be done during that 1,000 years. The good come back in human form with an opportunity, eternal life, because they were good. You know, what about all these billions of people that never heard the name Jesus? Or in church, they tell you they're all going to hell, which doesn't make sense. And Yahshua tells us that that's not the case. I think the last time we had this meeting, somebody talked about re-education and reorientation. It looks like the evil, if they are going to be judged, judgment doesn't mean just condemnation or damnation. Everything that's known about that person being judged is evident because Yahshua or his subordinates are doing the judging. All the facts are laid down as to why. And I think some of these are going to have an opportunity for life. That there's a rebellion at the end of the millennium, and obviously some are going to have a chance, but they still have free will, even though the devil isn't here. They still have free will to pick any way they want, any side they can. So I see that as 3 classes there. And I don't think that in Revelation, there's a lot of evidence there that that's the way it will or should work. It's what occurs to me anyway. It seems a far more equitable justice than just sending everybody that's not saved into hell. Okay.
Yeah.
Allison says, I agree with the 3 classes. Thank you.
I can't say that I entirely agree or disagree. I think when you said that the spirit part doesn't die. I think just as we discussed last week, I think that spirit isn't ours to begin with. It's it's on loan as the animating force of this body, and together those things allow a me to be formed, and I'm formed as I continue to walk around in this world, and I make choices, and I commit sins or I don't commit sins. I start putting into action, fulfilling the law in love, and making those things part of my character that last forever. So I wouldn't say that I think that the spirit part of us, dies or anything. I think that's...
I need some more evidence, right? I never got into any deeper, but this whole idea came up in my study after a woman in church, when we were talking about this. She said, I'm so upset because, my dear mother that raised me so well is in hell right now for eternity. There's nothing I can do about it.
Oh boy.
Well, that's pretty common in churches.
Yeah.
And especially here in the last couple of years, I've been hearing more and more preaching in that way. So that's when I really started to study into that possibility. The governor says there's 2 classes. I wonder if you could explain that. Gov?
Yeah, I don't think I said anything. I think that might have been Daniel.
Actually, that was me.
It's a chat.
That was
What
that was
are the
me.
2 classes?
I believe in a more traditional. I believe that those are who are alive in him. When he, wraps this thing up, those who be transformed, then I believe that those that are dead, who have gone on in Yeshua, those people will be resurrected. Now, actually, I should have said 3, because I do believe that there is going to be a resurrection of the damned, and they will be judged on their works. And at the end of everything, they'll go to their place. But I believe it's going to be a little different. Like, we think of it as individuals. I believe once you are gone into the damned, you go into a kind of a congregation of death, hell, and the grave. And those things will go into the lake of fire. So you don't go in as an individual, you go in as a body. Because, the enemy copycats everything that Yahweh has, the body of Messiah. He copycats that. So those people that'll be judged, they go in as a body, and of course they go into non-existence, I believe, because the lake of fire was not created for everybody. It was created for the enemy and the fallen angels, and or those fallen watchers, or whatever we call them. And that fire is there. So I believe that you just go into non-existence at that point.
Let me maybe posit some sort of heresy here. I was thinking about this last week or two, just trying to dive a little bit deeper into the idea of, what Paul talks about with regard to, by one man sin entered into the world, and by one man we achieve everlasting life or achieve life. What's interesting is that though Messiah has come and he's died and he's ascended to heaven, and I've accepted that, I'm still going to die. I still actually have to go through that thing. So it's almost like I'm still paying for something. So I was wondering, okay, like what am I paying for with this death, or what did Yeshua pay for? And I thought, okay, well, it looks to me that we can tell from the numerous scriptures, as we discussed last week, that both the wicked and the righteous are resurrected together. And so when Adam sinned, he introduces death, which we're all going to experience, and there's no way out of that. But because Messiah has come and done his thing, we are guaranteed a resurrection back to life. Now, that's not just for the believer. That's for both the wicked and the righteous, the believer and the unbeliever. Everybody gets resurrected. But it's a resurrection unto judgment for those that are not believers, right? So then they go through, and I think in a way it's not considered judgment for us, but I think we still go through the same fire, if you will. It's judgment for the wicked, but it's a refiner's fire and a fuller's soap for us, right? And as we hear Paul talk about with regard to the tabernacle in which we build upon the foundation of Messiah, we can choose to build it with gold and silver and precious stones that survive this fire. What fire do we go through if not the same fire, which is probably Yahweh himself, who cannot tolerate sin in his presence? Those that have nothing built on top of the foundation of Messiah are obliterated into ash, right? That fire consumes them. That's maybe the lake of fire itself, is that judgment fire. And for us, it's a purifying fire, making our gold pure, taking the dross out, separating our sin as far from as the east is from the west. But I wanted to emphasize that both the wicked and the just are both raised from the dead. So it seems to me that it's that Yeshua paid for us to be resurrected. And then we still have something to do in this life, even if we are accepting his gift of life after death, right? This resurrection. We are accepting all of that. Then we know that we're supposed to build upon that foundation and do something with this life and not just get our fire insurance and move on. Does that make sense?
Sure. It all takes a little more research. This would be a really good thing to actually get into and look at closer from a perspective of us autodidacts digging in a little more and seeing what we can come up with. But the lesson's great. I loved it. I think a lot of people need to hear it.
Appreciated.
Anybody else have anything? Well, brother, we give you a hand clap, and your check for $500 will be in the mail.
Excellent.
Okay. Appreciate it very much, and I know you'll come back.
My pleasure.
Yeah. There's one thing. Okay, great. Thank you, Jeremy, and thank you all.
Mm-hmm.